So, as I was listening to this podcast, I thought I was going to hear my ex-boyfriend talk about bartending for an hour. Instead, I got a very detailed update on his life from A to Z. I now knew where he worked and his schedule, so I found out that he was working at a family-owned bar restaurant in New Orleans, and he seems to really love his life. And this made me happy because I knew he didn't like temping very much. I could see that it was starting to weigh him down a little bit. But honestly, I also think him being with me was weighing him down because he needed to run from me. But I also knew that the temping was for sure a factor. It was a soul-crushing job. So he talked about his childhood, school, coming to New York City to start a band and shoot his shot at rockstardom. He spoke a lot about the band I saw him play in, the one that once rehearsed next door to mine a few weeks after we had broken up. He knew that if he wanted to get serious with his band, he would have to get out of his temping gig because it just wasn't working out. So he got into bartending. And here's the thing, I helped him get into bartending. When he faked his resume to get that job, he reached out to me for the first time since our breakup, and I volunteered to be his reference, even though he had never made a dime in the service industry. And I also told him everything I knew about bartending. Now, in the podcast, he talked to the woman who was interviewing him about how he, took all his bartender friends aside and sat down with them, and he took notes with his notebook. And I just remember sitting there with him with that notebook. And yeah, David had wiggled his way back into my life after I deleted him from my phone. And I realized that when he texted me a week prior, he was testing the waters to see if I would meet up with him to give him advice on how to handle his first bartending job. So it seems like he lied on his resume a little too well because a bar in Brooklyn hired him to completely run the bar program and create the menu. It turned out that some random guy in Brooklyn inherited a bar from his family and had no idea what he was doing. But David made it work. So when David first called me to ask if I would help him, he took me back to that unromantic but perfectly pleasant cafe we had our 1-year anniversary at. And when I met up with him to talk to him about his bartending job, I remember just how platonic it felt. It really just felt like friends. And I really liked that. I really liked it. Sure, he checked me out a little bit. I was looking pretty good, I'm not gonna lie. But I was serving major friend zone vibes. I wasn't really interested in him. Yeah, he looked good, but I wasn't really thinking reconnect or hook up or any of that. It just felt like a friend. So I realized, hey, maybe I can do the friend thing with him. And to be honest, I was really excited about it, and I was looking forward to this new phase in our friendship. But I had no idea as we were sitting there in that cafe and I was telling him everything I knew about bartending and he was taking notes. I had no idea that would be the last time I would ever see him again. So I'm listening to David continue to tell the interviewer about the questionable beginnings of his bartending career, which, was riddled in lies, but that's okay because I think that's a lot of, new bartenders. He then mentioned the girl that he fell in love with, and I wasn't expecting that at all. He eventually moved across the country to be with her and started bartending in the Midwest. So he went on. He left New York because his girlfriend wanted to be close to her family, and she lived out in the Midwest. But what's interesting is that the two of them eventually moved to the city that I grew up in, which was Chicago. I really grew up in the suburbs, but I spent a lot of time in Chicago, and I did live in Chicago at one point. So that was crazy because that was like another synchronicity that they lived in my city. But so what happened was David, he was starting to get a lot of work as a bass player on some very high-profile blues gigs. So she quit her job where she was to go with him to Chicago and start all over again. But it would only be a short matter of time before David would start touring the world, which also concluded the end of his relationship with this woman that he fell in love with. His burgeoning career would lead him to Brenda Valley, a singer who became quite famous. Now, Brenda was relatively unknown at the time that he started with her, but David explained that she blew up very quickly, and before he knew it, he was touring the world. He listed all the countries, well, not all the countries, but he listed many of the countries that he played in, and I just couldn't believe my ears. He was really just living that dream. And he said that in some countries, Brenda would be on billboards all over the country. It was some real rock star shit, he said. And he mentioned he was the only single guy in the band and had some very nice hotel rooms. So reading between the lines, it seems like he got laid all over the world and had groupies and all of that. So since he was on the road so much, he mentioned that the band decided to leave their apartments where they were paying rent, and they all ended up living in a house together in New Orleans. Then David said, and then I got myself fired. So while David didn't elaborate on this, I can only guess that he likely partied his way out of a job. Obviously, there were women. International. He was an international lover. It is what it is. That's what happened. But I couldn't help but wonder, did he enjoy every minute of it? Was he living his best life? Or was it also his way of dealing with a broken heart from losing the woman that he loved? So at this point, David mentioned going from worldwide rock stardom to all of a sudden driving an Uber in New Orleans and figuring out his next move. So he tried to break into the music scene, but it didn't really seem to be happening for him. So he got back into bartending. And decided to take it seriously as a career. He got himself a job at a top-rated restaurant as a bar back and started exploring the world of mixology. So at the end of the podcast, they mentioned where he was presently working and his schedule, which happened to be Sunday through Tuesday. Now, just remember Sunday through Tuesday because this is going to be important for future episodes. Actually, they said that he was working the blenders Sunday through Tuesday or something like that, but this will be important in the future. So as this podcast came to a close, I could not believe how much I had just learned about David's life. It almost felt as when I felt his presence in the room that maybe I had a psychic sense that this podcast existed and that I was supposed to get this detailed update on his life after years of not really thinking about him that much. I thought about him, but not from an emotional place, a very detached place. However, I was so blown away that he really, truly lived this rock star life, and I was so happy for him that he did that thing, because my time in New York, I got to meet hundreds and actually thousands of musicians, and only a small handful got to the point where they were touring the world. So even though he eventually lost that, I was just so happy and so proud that he lived it in the first place. Now at this point, my curiosity got the better of me, so I decided, hey, let's look him up on Facebook. It's been a while. And sure enough, there were photos of David just touring the world. And he looked happy and animated in a way that I had never really seen him in the course of our relationship. During this phase, he had a major glow up. He looked hot. Oh my God. And he was always very attractive. Like, I always found him very hot. But during this phase of his life, he looked like a rock star, like he was on top of the world. And I don't think I want to know how many women he got with. He looked great. But in a way, I kind of patted myself on the back. I was like, yeah, this is my ex. This is kind of fun. But here's what's interesting. Around the time that he stopped playing music for a living was around the time that I stopped playing music for a living. And neither one of us chose that. We didn't want to stop playing music for a living. Life just kind of worked out that way. So that was another synchronicity between us. And I realized at this point, I had deleted most of the messages between us at this time. I mean, we had tons of email messages and stuff, but I got rid of them, just so I could heal from this. But there was a thread of messages between us on Facebook. So I figured, you know what? Let's read them. Why not? So I decided to read them and go down memory lane. And the last time we spoke was when David messaged me from the road in 2015. So I scrolled through our conversation and I could not believe my eyes. I looked at the timestamp of the last message I sent to him in response to his. I sent it at 3:33 p.m.